Symposium. So in this presentation, I will summarize a guideline that I published on how to study animal cognition and decision making in the wild using an observational approach. So it's meant mainly for scholars who want to have more insight in evolutionary function of cognitive abilities and the context in which they're used in the wild by primates, and also scholars who cannot do experiments because of ethical or conservation reasons. For example, when you work with highly endangered chimpanzees. So in the next 15 minutes, I will discuss some of the steps that scholars can take that need a little bit more explanation. And I illustrate that with examples from my research with the chimpanzees. So yeah, when you cannot do experiments, you cannot provide a stimulus, it's difficult to grasp the moment where individuals will really use cognition and employ it. So the trick is to find a situation in which they get the information somehow and then measure, but decide on that moment is not always easy. So what you can do is you can think about evolutionary function of the cognitive ability of interest, for example, planning. What are the challenges faced? How can a primate overcome these challenges? And then find situations in which they are likely motivated to employ their cognitive ability and then start your measurements. Now, one of the challenges that primates, almost all primates, especially chimpanzees, face is finding ripe fruit. It's a frequently changing resource. Fruiting trees get depleted, new season starts, so primates need to continuously update themselves on where and when to go to find food. We know from earlier studies from the 90s on Japanese macaques that and other studies that primates use fruiting synchrony to discover fruit-bearing trees. So this simultaneous emergence of fruits in many trees. So they use the discovery of fruit in one tree as an indicator for the presence of fruit in other trees of the same species. But yeah, when you go into more detail in the ecological data and the fruiting histories of primate fruit trees, you see that, and I discovered that during my PhD already and later during my postdoc, that there's quite some variation in synchrony levels. So the probability that if one tree bears fruit, that another tree within that same species also bears fruit varies strongly between species. So some species have 80% of their trees full of fruit, so it makes sense to go and look for other trees, while other species have only 10%. So within this ecological situation, this context, I thought, chimpanzees would really benefit from using intuitive statistics, a cognitive ability. They know which proportion of trees bear fruit in which species. That would help them to increase their food finding success. So in short, I studied chimpanzees in situations where they inspected trees at the start of several fruiting seasons to increase my chance of detecting their use of cognition. Now, another step that is useful to take is to think about alternative explanations. Obviously, behavior can be expression of many different cognitive abilities. It can be that if the chimpanzee inspects a fruit tree that is using intuitive statistics, but it can also be that it's using sensory cues. So the trick is to then record variables in situations where you can exclude these alternative explanations. For example, by recording informative failing. So ask the question, what do chimpanzees fail to find? And I'll explain why. So we recorded inspections, 3 inspections for in continuous periods, totaling 275 days. And here you see some of these inspections. Let's see, this should work. It's some time, maybe. Yeah. So here we see a young male looking up in the direction of a tree crown. Looking down on the ground, presumably checking for fallen fruits. Here we see an inspection of subadult male. He will look up to the right in the direction of a tree crown. He looks up now, and the little one behind him presumably follows his gaze and also has a good look what is up there. And then we have a very clear example of an inspection where the whole group stops traveling, sits down, have a good look on what's in the tree. The focal female I followed, she's scratching herself, excited or a bit nervous maybe. Maybe thinking, if there's fruit, will we all fit in that tiny tree? And I don't know what she's thinking, but her sun goes up. And in this case, the fruits are not ripe and they continue traveling. And we were specifically interested in inspections of empty trees that did not bear any fruit and it could not cue the chimpanzees to look up. And so by recording when the chimpanzees would stop traveling, look in a direction at the ground and would fail to find fruits, we basically gained insight in their expectations. And by recording, observing this behavior in this specific context, we could exclude the possibility that she used sensory cues. So sort of controlling by observation. We recorded inspection probability, so the proportion of time the chimpanzees inspected a tree, an empty tree, the same day or the day after feeding on fruit of that same species. So if they feed on species A, do they or do they not then inspect at least one empty tree the day after or the same day? And then we recorded synchrony levels using fruit availability data for 11 years in the chimpanzee territory. And this is a schematic example. And we calculated high synchrony levels when all the trees within the species bear fruit at the same time. So one is fruit, zero is no fruit. And lower values were calculated when certain tree individuals, like the trees here, they do not fruit within season or they fruit in other times of the year, like many figs do. And then we plotted the two against each other. Here the dots are the tree species, so the figs have low levels of synchrony. And we have here mean inspection probability after feeding on inspection of empty trees. We then ran a generalized linear mixed model to control for also fruit-bearing tree density to make sure it was not the density of fruit trees that triggered their inspections. And we found that it's really the synchrony level of the fruit species. So what proportion, that influenced their inspection probability. So these results from this study were consistent with the possibility that the chimpanzees used intuitive statistics. They knew which species have high synchrony levels, a high success rate of finding other fruit-bearing trees, irrespective of their density. And nice thing was that this study was confirmed, this ability was confirmed with captive chimpanzees in experimental setting. And the nice thing about the fieldwork is then that it gives additional insight in the evolutionary function of the ability. Now, another important step to take, I think, is to not only record events, but also non-events. So in primatology, field primatology, especially observational studies, we have a tendency to only record what the animal does. So what trees it feeds in, which animals, individuals it grooms, but not so much which trees it doesn't feed in or which individual it doesn't groom. And yeah, as an experimental scientist, you may know the value of this, of recording when an animal does not react to a certain stimulus. So I asked the questions what chimpanzees do, but also what they do not do. And I did that in the context of this question. So after discovering these first fruits in the season, do chimpanzees inspect any tree of the same species or only specific trees of these highly synchronous species? And I asked that question because I knew, again, from ecological data that some trees produce more reliably than others. So here we see in green the months that the trees bear ripe fruit. And if I was a chimpanzee, I would especially inspect this tree with ripe fruit 10 times in 11 years, and not so much this tree number 8. I also knew that some species produce consistently more fruit than others. So here we see the percentage of ripe fruit months with more than 50% ripe fruit cover. So meaning when the tree was full of fruits. And for example, in this particular fruit species, we find some individual is an outlier. He had more than 30% of the months that there was fruit. He had a full crown. But there are also individuals, trees, that never have a full crown. So knowing this ecological data, we can predict that it should pay to differentiate between individual trees and not only inspect trees that are likely to bear large amounts, and to only expect those that are likely to bear large amounts of fruit. So when did I do this? I investigated by looking at what trees do chimpanzees visit, but also which ones they do not visit. And so to do that, I sampled the context. So I sampled for the availability of information prior to the start of observations. So I recorded events and non-events, which we call also a quasi-experiment. So we didn't manipulate anything, but we knew before what the information was and only then started recording. So we pre-sampled the trees that were available. We did this by following a chimpanzee for 28 days. We could also have done it by walking transects and just looking for trees. But here we were sure that the trees at least contained edible fruits. The next year, we followed the same female again, covering the same fruiting season. And we had again a number of trees. And then the third year, we recorded the ranging behavior towards these last year feeding trees. So we had about 505 trees that were visited in 2009, 2010. And then 180 were approached. And out of these 180, 32 trees were fed in, and 148 were not, and presumably did not bear edible fruit. And then we looked at, out of these 148 approaches, which trees were inspected and which ones were not, and were maybe passed by on the way to other food sources. And again, by running a GLMM, we were able to show that both the maximum amount of fruit in the previous years, so some trees were visited multiple times, that's why we took the maximum amount, and the number of feeding visits, so their familiarity with the tree, influenced inspection probability. So the more familiar they were with the tree, the higher the chance that they would inspect the tree if they would come within detection distance. Now, from this study, these results were consistent again with the possibility that wild chimpanzees use an across-seasonal memory, or maybe you could call it even a year-long memory, when they monitor fruit trees. And again, this was supported by also work on captive chimpanzees by an experimental approach. Now, lastly, I want to discuss the step to try and record variables that allow for testing of conditional decision-making, interactive effects. So what do chimpanzees only do when certain conditions are met? And this I did in the context of a study on planting behavior. So once they have discovered this fruiting tree with lots of fruits in the beginning of the season, when do they return? Do they plan their return and, for example, depart earlier for certain fruits than for others? So these are the results of this study. Here we look at nest departure times in sunrise. So 0 is when the sun comes up, and dark is when it's still dark. And then we have the distance from the nest, the sleeping site in the tree, to the breakfast site. And what we found was that chimpanzees depart earlier to breakfast on figs, which are here the yellow dots, but only when they're far away. So if they're close by, the yellow and the purple dots are mixed, and when they go further apart, they separate. And some of these departures were also really in the dark. Now, we knew that figs are eaten by more animal species than any other plant genus. When we returned to a feeding tree, we found that the proportion of time sympatric animals were feeding in the tree think of monkeys, squirrels, birds, are much higher for fig trees than for other fruits. And so the results were best explained by the possibility that chimpanzees flexibly plan to depart earlier to reach fig breakfast sites in time to kind of compensate for travel time to beat the competition. Now you may wonder, why is this line going up? So that's the model line that significantly predicts departure time for the other fruits. So the other fruits are fruits like nuts or huge fruits that only chimpanzees can eat. So there's no competition. And for this, you also need to know that when breakfast is far away, they cannot reach it through the trees. So they have the nest in the trees and they can travel through the trees to reach nearby feeding sites. But when it's far, they have to go down to the forest ground. And there it can be dangerous. Leopards are very active in this area, and especially early in the morning. So what we think happens is that when there is no real competition, there was no need to leave earlier, they would simply wait until the forest was light and then leave. Now, this is an example of an interactive effect. So by measuring these variables like distance, type of food, and to test for their interactions, we can test also for conditional decision making. So what does a primate only do when certain conditions are met? So chimps only leave earlier for figs when they are far further away. Now, I hope I've convinced you that by identifying crucial context, controlling for interfering factors by including behavior observations of what animals fail to find, do not do, or only do when, and by combining this with well-thought-out statistical models, and I didn't have a lot of time to explain them, but you can read about it, based on growing biological knowledge, we have decades now of data on primates, studies in the lab, in the field of their behavior, we are able to study decision-making by observational approach. And then to briefly link to the topic of this symposium, the comparative research, we of course would want to compare travel decisions across species and populations. So I'm very happy to show this paper that just got out, where we've discovered a wealth of data on natural travel paths in many different primate populations collected by primatologists, which is untapped potential for comparisons of travel decisions across species. So I'd like to thank our research team in Ivory Coast, Max Planck Institute, and all my colleagues who helped, and you for listening. And I look forward to your questions, and I hope I did not go over time. And now I'm going to hear myself. Any questions?
Thanks, Karline. It was great. If there's, again, it was a great talk. If there's one quick question, we'll take it. No question. Otherwise, we'll just move on and try to save time. I'm sure question will come up. I have a couple of questions. I saved them for the discussion.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Karline. So